you're living your authentic life, the solution will naturally appear, or the right opportunity will naturally appear, or you'll create that new opportunity for yourself.
Yeah.
So I'm a big believer in just trusting your intuition, listening to your intuition, especially for women. We know ourselves more than the world would let us think. So following that voice and let your voice be heard.
Hello, and welcome to Working Your Way, the podcast dedicated to exploring the journey of authenticity in the workplace and discovering how to navigate it your way. I'm your host, Sandhya Sadakar, and today I am thrilled to welcome Amanda ReCupido to the show. Amanda is a seasoned communications professional. She's an agency leader. She's a writer and a producer. And her career has been shaped by her love of storytelling and her commitment to aligning her work to what matters most to her. Now, in this episode, Amanda shares her journey from corporate media to nonprofit arts organizations and ultimately to her current role in a leadership role at an agency. We dive into what it takes to balance personal expression and professional ambition. We talk about how to embrace your creative process, and Amanda shares how she navigates a very full and diverse portfolio of career endeavors. Amanda also opens up about her struggles with fertility and family planning and the unexpected lessons that this taught her, and how she's really been able to turn her lived experiences into fulfilling creative pursuits that have a meaningful impact. Okay, let's get into the conversation. Okay, welcome, Amanda, to Working Your Way. I am excited to have you on.
I'm so happy to be here.
So I want to start off by, I've just had this curiosity about people lately about career and like the career beliefs we form early in our lives or what we wanted to be when we grew up when we were like a little person. And I'm curious, did you form any kind of ideas about career when you were little?
Oh, of course. We are always absorbing the cultural norms, even when we don't realize it. And it's funny because for our work Halloween, our theme was to dress as what you wanted to be when you grew up.
I love that.
And so I thought to myself, there were two things I wanted to be at like age 10, let's say. And it was to be a Girl Scout leader, because my mom was, and to be an author. And I figured, okay, to dress up as an author, I would just like hold a book. So I ended up wearing an old like Girl Scout vest. And when my boss was like, what, you wanted to be a Girl Scout when you grew up? And I'm like, well, I'm already an author. So that felt exciting. No, but I think then as I was older, getting into high school and college, I was still following my writing. And, my dad was kind of like, okay, are you going to be a poet full time? What's happening here? I bought the LSAT book and then promptly returned it. I knew that was not my journey, but I did want to follow my heart in some way, but also realizing I had to make money. Quick overview of my career. After I graduated college, I went out to New York. I started working in magazines when magazines were still a physical form of media. And even as you say, like, what are our norms? It's like, you didn't wear jeans in the office. It was very corporate, very cubicle farm, very serious. And I thought, and I know, your podcast talks a lot about authenticity. It felt like I had to be a certain type. Meanwhile, I was still pursuing writing. And this is also when blogs were a thing. And I was writing for a lit blog and going to all these literary events after work hours. So I had my work personality and my fun, creative personality. And that has kind of followed me throughout my career. So from there, I went into an arts nonprofit for a few years, moved back to Chicago, rekeyed my resume with another magazine, another arts nonprofit, and then I came into agency life. And here I am.
Yeah. So, gosh, it's like it feels like this kind of movie scene, right? Of graduating college and moving to New York and working in media. Was it everything that the movies make it out to be?
Oh, absolutely not. I mean, this was also, I graduated high school the year that Sex and the City ended. So the Carrie Bradshaw of it all was still very front and center. I think the first movie came out a year after I'd moved to New York. And of course, since I was writing a blog, everyone was like, oh my gosh, you're Carrie Bradshaw. And of course, the other was Prado was still very new. This was also an era I was just speaking with someone the other day. Like, you didn't have to pay interns at this point either. So it was a very different working world. But then, of course, the reality is, you can't afford these glamorous apartments, especially in New York. I had 4 roommates. I, lived on Roosevelt Island, which now is very trendy, but in the early aughts, no one had ever heard of it. So there was a lot more hustle than I expected.
And what do you think attracted you to media in the first place?
Again, words and stories and getting your voice heard. And I think that's how I ultimately ended up in communications is, you're telling someone else's story. And I remember when I turned 30, because, having worked for 2 arts nonprofits by that time, I was promoting actors and comedians and, other people's art. And I was good at it and, still very much enjoying communicating a brand story and, making the change in the world through that way. But it's time for me to start telling my own story too. Because I had stopped at some point in my move back to Chicago. I was no longer blogging. Blogs kind of went away. And I'd really set writing aside for maybe a good 5 years. And I remember there was one time shortly after I'd married my husband. I'm not sure if we had bought our house yet or we're looking, but it was just kind of this okay, well, I, checked the boxes of what you're supposed to do. And now what? And do I really want to make this writing thing real? And how do I do that? So that's when I kind of restarted my side hustle of creative pursuits.
I feel like there was maybe this negotiation in your head of what you want to do versus what a quote unquote real job is. Was that happening?
Absolutely. And I tell people because throughout the years, there have been, even coworkers who asked me how I maintain both parts of my personality. And, you have to just believe in yourself and do it. No one is going to push you. And it's interesting because when I even got the job I have now, and I had taken some time off right before to really put all my energy into some creative projects, I was so proud of building, a show from scratch, like a podcast, putting my words out there, my vulnerability. And then I got this job and I got way more engagement on social media because that is just what people come to expect. But I also, when people do ask me how I maintain my creative pursuits, I tell them to read The Artist's Way. It's from, I want to say early 90s, but I read it, I cried. One of the big questions at the beginning is who in your life told you couldn't be an artist? And again, your parents are going to worry that, you're financially secure, that you have a good job, you're on a good path. No one's going to say, hey, did you write today? Did you, practice your instrument? Did you paint? So it's like, yes, be gentle on yourself. I certainly do not write every day, but it's be gentle, but also keep pursuing what you want to pursue.
I'm wondering where did you get the energy to do it? So there's the motivation, right? To keep this creative side of yourself. And there's so many times where when the rubber hits the road, we're just too tired after work or whatever it is. And I don't know, I think it could come from a lot of places. It could come from passion. It could come from ambition. It could come from who knows where. How does it work for you?
Oh boy, yes. As my mother told me, I was always a hyper child. And I remember distinctly the year 2018. I do not, looking back, I had no idea how I did this because my husband and I had published a children's book. So we were hustling that, going to bookstores, physically going with copies of books, going to the arts and crafts fair to sell our book. I was a spin instructor. I had a full-time job. I was also going to fertility treatments. Again, I remember that year, it's well, I still have plenty of time to watch HGTV. It's I should feel different. Then of course, with, retrospect, it's well, that was clearly a coping mechanism just to be as busy as possible to not think about, this big grease that was happening in my life. And I think I always joke when people ask for advice, I say, figure out what your trauma response is and then figure out how to monetize it. And so having this very fast-paced type A personality has done me very well. I think there's also been times where it has harmed me because some of the manifestations of anxiety are rewarded when really what I needed was rest. So I think throughout my life too is recognizing, okay, is this a good, am I really charged by this? And it's good to be busy. and what things I can let others lead and to take off my schedule and my to-do list.
I love the monetizing of the trauma response. It's like you're avoiding something, so you're keeping busy. So how can you keep busy in a way that's going to contribute to your future career?
I'm very good at taking chaos and organizing it, and a lot of organizations need that.
Yes, that's absolutely true. I remember about 5 or 10 years ago when we hit this kind of peak of glorifying being busy. It was this kind of lifestyle of overscheduling ourselves and making it seem like being super busy all the time made us more important in some way. And I think a lot of us have started to really move away from the glorification of being busy, but there's definitely still a lot of using this idea of kind of being busy or making ourselves busy as a coping mechanism, like Amanda mentioned. In essence, it's using being busy as a way to avoid something that maybe we don't want to deal with. Like if I stay busy, I can avoid what's present in my life that I don't want to, or maybe don't have the ability or the tools to deal with right now. Now, for those of us who fall in the camp of being a doer, type A person, an ambitious person, achiever type, someone who moves quickly into action, which I believe likely is a lot of you who listen to this podcast, this is something that's really important to explore. And I say this with a lot of compassion because I have been there and I likely will visit there again sometime in the future. Sometimes we do this because we just can't deal with what else is going on in our lives. Whether it's too difficult or overwhelming, we just don't know how to deal with it. Now, in my work with my own therapist, actually very recently, we've been exploring touching into emotions that have been too much to really process or handle in the past, or maybe overwhelming for me to deal with. And so my body just kind of shuts them down. And how to, in a healthy way, really be with those things. And the process is almost like building up a muscle or training to work with them. So when we're talking about a trauma response, I know we're kind of joking in the conversation, but not really. It's really our way of doing what feels safer for us, and keeping busy often feels safer than exploring something emotionally that could just be too much for our bodies to process. Now, I think what's critical here is being able to recognize what might be happening and just be aware of it when we might be doing this, using busyness as a coping strategy. And 2, it's important to discern where that coping mechanism of the busyness maybe starts to become more harmful for us than helpful, where we might be doing damage, whether it's physically, emotionally, mentally, or whatever, to ourselves and by staying busy. It's overworking, it's not sleeping, it's not allowing downtime or rest for our bodies or for our minds. And these things add up over time and they manifest in really negative ways that can have long-term consequences. Burnout is just one of those consequences. Okay, so let's get back to the conversation where Amanda shares more about the difficult things that she was going through during that time and how her career was impacted as a result. So you mentioned you were going through some grief at this time, right? Going through fertility treatments. Like, talk a little bit about how that impacted you as a person.
Yeah. And again, it's one of those things that I only recognized it after the fact. Going through it, it was just like survival mode, even if I wasn't aware that that was happening. So I was talking to my mother recently, and I was saying, if like we got pregnant exactly when I wanted to, my career would not look the same. I started writing as a response, not being pregnant when I wanted to. I was at a time in my career where I was mid-level at not the agency I'm at now, and it would have been very attractive to get pregnant and quit. And, I'd like to think that I would have come back to work in some capacity because I'm a person who loves being busy and loves to be challenged, but I can't answer that for sure. And I clearly got over, that phase of my life. And because, again, my trauma response is to lean in. As I was going through these treatments, it was just that same year I got promoted. And then the next year, COVID hit. And so I was then all of a sudden leading the sector of business, hadn't gone through my own personal challenge. Now the world is going for a challenge. I was one of those people who thrived in COVID, and it gave me a lot of confidence because I remember I was a very new VP. The other VPs at that company were very seasoned, decades of experience over me. And because the world went virtual, there was some equal footing to be had. And I also saw where I'm like, okay, well, I'm not traveling at all this year. Like I'm bunkering down. I see where this is going, and seeing, it taking some other people some time to realize what was happening. So again, the trauma response being helpful of just like, okay, let's pivot, but make some plans. How do we exist in this new world? And then, how do we come out of it? How do we manage our teams through it? And I was still able to grow clients and revenue because there were needs that came out of COVID and communicating for sure. So, there's a saying, never waste a good crisis. There's always opportunity to be found.
Yeah. You're taking the PR slogan and making it a life theme, right?
Exactly.
That's amazing. So I know that you created not just started writing after experiencing kind of challenges for fertility, but you made a whole podcast inspired by that journey, right?
Yes, I did. And I would say that my approach to writing and work, there's some similarities there because the way the podcast evolved, I was just writing to get my feelings out. So some of it was funny. It was very sarcastic. Some of it was more emotional, essay writing. And at one point, I had written a pilot, so a fake episode of TV. I think most people know what pilots are. And this was in the pandemic. So I also recognized, I'm like, well, I don't know if there's going to be any TV studios knocking on my door to make this pilot. So how can I produce this myself? And I kind of cobbled together the story that I had in that pilot with some of these humor pieces and other writings that I had done and cobbled this together. And it worked really well. So it wasn't like I set out to do a podcast. It just kind of organically happened. And I think throughout my career, yes, I am a person who sets goals, but it's much more difficult to say, I'm going to climb Mount Everest versus, okay, I'm going to start with a hike tomorrow on
right.
much lower terrain. So it is this just kind of gradual step by step where it's like, oh my gosh, I didn't even realize how far I climbed. Well, I was just pursuing my interests and having fun.
It seems like you are someone who, you said it yourself, you never waste a good crisis, but you're someone who takes your kind of lived experience and turns it into a creative endeavor. And I don't know, what does it do for you?
Yeah, and I have a lot of conversations with other people who write various things, whether it's journalism or other types of fiction. And some people cannot write about themselves. And that is like the only thing I can write about. Because to me, like art is that expression. It is like, please see me. Like this is my personal experience, but it also is emblematic of this like larger conversation. So with infertility, my podcast was coming out it was around the fall of Roe. So women's reproductive health care was very top of mind. And, while I personally, didn't experience things like miscarriage, or other major medical complications, that is all part of that journey. And, those were things that were being denied in different states. And then, of course, what was happening nationally, politically. So it became very the personal is political. It became very urgent for me. And it showed, I am pursuing this. I want to start a family. And here are all the ways that it could go wrong. So it almost like radicalized me more. And it made me realize that my voice was important in fleshing out that story.
I'm so curious because you are an ambitious person, you're a goal-oriented person, and you're a creative person. And so when you finished that, how did you feel?
Yes, I am working on feeling my accomplishments more. This is something. And I think, I'm friends with a lot of other very ambitious women. So we do a good job of, you're killing it. Do you feel like you're killing it? And really congratulating each other. And, it's something that, has improved over the years. I used to be much harder on myself. And I think, for other people, who produce, because these things, they take such a long time, speaking about a birth, that, you're already kind of thinking about, or maybe even in draft form of like your next project. And I think there's a famous quote, I want to say it's Ernest Hemingway. If it's not, please edit that out, of I hate writing, I love having written. And I feel that. I love having something to submit, because I think it's in that doing. And I think that's, just having come up in PR and pitching media, it's very fast paced of getting things out there, where it's like, great, I wrote something, like I want to go to a reading and see how people respond. I'm going to get some edits so that I can tinker it. I'm going to submit it to, screenplay contest, or submit it to a website to run. So I think that is exciting. It makes it more of a game, because rejection is part of the writing experience. So it's the more reps, the more times you can get your work out there, the higher probability that you will have success. And same with work. Especially in a creative field, not every idea is going to land, whether that's internally with the team or with the client. And as you age, as you mature, hopefully those coincide, you begin to take things less personally. Like I think when I was, back in New York and writing my blog, I wasn't ready to take on a book-sized project. I was still taking things way too personally. I was very immature. And now if I get a rejection, it's like, great, now I can go to the next one on my list. It is, sometimes they hurt, of course, but it's feedback. Right. Everything's feedback.
So Amanda mentioned this quote, I hate writing, but I love having written. And I did look it up, and I believe it's been attributed most often to Dorothy Parker, who is a poet and a fiction writer. But something that I've learned is, I swear, 90% of the things that we quote weren't actually ever said by the person that we're quoting them to. So even though this is attributed to her, there's also some questions about who really said it, or if she said it in the first place. I remember a few years ago, I was trying to understand the context of what I thought was a Gandhi quote, because it had been attributed to him everywhere, in t-shirts, posters, everything. And it turns out he never even actually said it. But anyway, back to the point, this quote, I wonder what it is about enjoying the phase of being done more than the phase of actually doing the thing. Maybe it's the dopamine hit of the accomplishment, or the satisfaction we feel when we have that finished product. And it's a topic that we've talked about before on this podcast, and one I think about a lot in my business. Am I excited about the end state of a goal versus actually considering how much I'm going to enjoy the process of getting there? Now, if my goal is only satisfying once I've achieved it, and I hate every step that I have to take to get there, or I'm dreading every piece of it along the way, am I really working in a way that's authentic to me? No. And if that answer is no, I think it's important to consider what would need to be true in order to make that process more enjoyable. Now, I talked about how to do this in a special episode that I did earlier this month with my podcast producer, Hayden, and specifically dived into more about how considering the process just as much as the outcome was actually one of the reasons that I started this podcast in the first place. And that's episode 59, if you want to go back and check it out. Now, for Amanda, she mentioned how she loves having written because it gives her something for people to respond to see how the world or the reader or the client receives this thing that she's created. In a way, it makes it more real when you get feedback on something that's lived in your head or on your laptop, and it's now out in the world. So as we get back into the conversation, we get more into how she takes in feedback when that thing is out in the world and how she's learned to work with it over the years. Yeah, so how do you negotiate the balance between personal expression and the creative process with now you have this thing out in the world that's going to be judged and the validation that can come or not come with that?
It's funny because I have so much writing out there throughout the years, and some of it that I'm proud of and some of that's like, whatever, but I threw it up on my Medium blog, like whatever it is. I'm always surprised what connects with people. There's the things I think I'm very proud of that I hope and does connect with people. And then there's random things where I'll hear from someone even from another country, or like years after I wrote something, there will be a comment on a post I wrote. And it's like, okay. There's another quote about we write because somewhere out there's someone with a wound the same size as your words, or something like that. I might have botched that quote. So I feel like I write for a purpose. And even if I don't know who that writing is for, I hope it reaches somewhere. But I will also say, when I staged a musical that I wrote and produced. It had 2 runs. By the second run, I don't know what it is. And, having worked in nonprofit art space before, I remember directors saying they couldn't watch their own work. And I understand that now, because I would sit there just so nervous. Even though the audience was laughing, even though the actors were doing great. I remember telling a friend, it's like, I can't do anything today. I just have to sit there and make everything perfect with my mind. So it can be very nerve-wracking. Less so about the judgment, but just it's overwhelming to see, again, something you've created brought to life. I think it's easier when it's work, because yes, you've done something, but it's much more outside yourself than something personal.
Yeah, totally. I hear in what you're saying more of a personal standard that you would want to achieve, or it's not so much about what other people think of it, but it's about could you have done that a little bit better, or maybe a little bit of you can't even call it perfectionism, right? Because it's art can't be perfect, but it's whatever version that we would want it to be. So,
I mean, art's completely subjective, and I think it's better that any review that you take personally is yourself, and it's not necessarily critics, because everyone's going to feel a certain way. But as long as it achieved the goals that you set out to achieve, because then it's intrinsic, and you're not doing it for anyone else but yourself.
Totally. I like to say career advice is perfectly designed for the person who's giving it, not the person that they're giving it to. And
Absolutely.
It's the same thing, right? It's this person is saying what worked for them or what they would do in that situation. And we just have to put it through a filter of what's right for us, or what do we actually care about.
Exactly.
So you made this transition into agency life. How many years has it been now?
Ooh, total in agency, it's been a decade.
What drove that change for you?
And again, as I shared my very brief career journey, I was repeating my resume, and I recognized working internally, there was always going to be a time when I would get bored, because the activities for the year always repeated themselves. Maybe they would change a little bit, but it's oh, we always do this, every year. And then here's the time for this again. And with agency life, there's always something new. Clients come and go, team members come and go. Even we had our final staff meeting of the year yesterday, where I'm at now, and we were saying where we are now, we would never have guessed it a year ago. And that's always exciting, is that the agency at the end of the year should never be the same agency from the start of the year. You should be, when I say growing, it doesn't necessarily have to mean revenues and clients and size and staff and all of that, but there should be some type of movement forward. And it did take me a while to translate my experience in nonprofits to an agency. It took me about a year from when I decided I wanted to pursue an agency to convincing one of them to hire me. And again, I came in,
I
was in my late 20s. So I'd already been working a good long while. And I was very happy that this local, smaller mid-sized agency saw in my experience that I could translate my skills. And I think even when we hire now, it's not necessarily apples to apples. They need agency. They need this exact client experience. But the best creative ideas come from, diversity of all kinds. And that means diversity of backgrounds. If you're coming from a different industry, you have a great outside perspective that you can offer, other than everyone offering the same ideas. And I know you know that coming from, your corporate world too.
Yeah. And it's hard to make those transitions, right? Because it does require a company or a person to see that value when it's not so linear. I went through that myself. I was trying to kind of change into a slightly different type of role in a different type of industry, and not even getting interviews. And I'm my resume is very impressive. I promise you I can figure it out, but they're not going to believe you unless there's like a special kind of place that can be a little more imaginative, like the opportunity that you got.
Yeah. And I will say, if there's job seekers listening to this, I have always, maybe not for every single job, but I've always been called out for my cover letter. And, and I receive a lot of resumes in my position, and I can tell you that we open it and it's a skim. So to really stand out, it is demonstrating like, can you write? Are you not just, please don't use ChatGPT or any of the AI stuff, especially these younger folks that I'm seeing. And, what's going to work best is, can you use critical thinking skills? Are you creative? It's just going to help you in your career if you are flexible. And that's why agency life is so interesting to me, because I have worked on healthcare. I have media trained people at the Federal Reserve Bank. In my agency now, we work on travel. I, become a quote unquote expert in so many different industries. And while I have, personal expertise and personal interest in some over others, it's not hard to apply the same creative solutions or approaches, no matter what client you have.
I love that. And I have a confession to make that I hate writing cover letters. And one of my biggest motivations for keeping my business going and making this successful.
Never writing a cover letter.
Apply to a job again and write a cover letter. No, I'm deadly serious. Unfortunately, it's a good motivation.
Whatever works.
I think it does require it is a skill set, right? It's like getting the information in, standing out, being creative. I guess that's why my dating app profiles were never great. It's kind of the same. I'm like, I have a lot more personality in person, I guarantee, than on writing.
Well, sure. And that's all that it's there to do, is to get you in the room so you can demonstrate how awesome you are. And it is, again, it all comes back to storytelling. And I know it's really hard for a lot of people to talk about themselves, and it's really made me challenge and think about what are my values in my approach to work. And I had done a great exercise with someone who came and did some coaching with us. And, my approach to leadership, it's integrity, impact, and joy. Mm-hmm. And I'm also one of those people who I view myself as a builder. And I think as you advance in your career, it's, we're all doers in some way. And as I mentioned before about my trauma response, of taking that mess and kind of creating order in the chaos. And to me, if the pieces are there, I love figuring out how to put them together. And to me, that's building. So it's building a sector of business. At my last agency, it's putting systems in place in my operational role here. I've done that with volunteer work outside of work, of really capacity building, just so things run smoother so that you can add your creative work on top of that. But if you're still just trying to get the fundamentals, it's making your job 10 times harder.
Yeah. And so when you kind of went through and identified what's really important to you, how well do you feel like that lines up with what you're doing now? And what did you learn from that exercise?
Yeah, and it was one of those exercises where you have the whole list of words, and then, you start circle 20, and then, get down to 3.
Narrow it down. Yeah.
Exactly. And as a words person, words are meaningful. So it was, and it could be fun sometimes to be like, well, these mean the same thing. So this one's the more powerful word. And I have those words on Post-it notes, on my wall next to my desk. And first, we didn't do that exercise too long ago. It was just, I want to say last year. So maybe they're 2 years old. So I do think that they are in alignment with how I continue to focus my work and how I just am as a person too, and how I show up in my everyday.
Now, these types of exercises are super helpful. And they're some of my favorite things to do with clients when I work with them one-on-one. Putting language to who you are and how you lead is really what this is about. And it's equal parts internal exploration and external communication, both exploring what's important to you and describing it to the world in a way that they can understand you and they can see with some clarity. Now, Amanda mentioned 3 words to describe her leadership approach: integrity, impact, and joy. And she also talked about being a builder, being someone who makes order out of chaos, and being someone who moves things into action. Now, these are all things that are critical to her working in a way that's authentic to her. Now, sometimes these could be referred to as core values or leadership principles. And personally, I think it's important to distinguish core values from other things that describe how you show up. Core values are sometimes just these aspirational words that we want to be or a company wants to be, but I really strongly disagree with this approach. I believe the core values should be the things that you live every day, even without any effort. Like, who are you when no one is looking and no external circumstances are dictating your behavior? Now, leadership principles or your approach to leadership, I believe, can leave some room for aspiration. Maybe you aren't leading this way all the time, but you're really actively putting in the effort in order to be a certain way or to show up in a certain style of leadership. Now, they shouldn't be things that you're just aspiring to but never embody. And we'll come back to this in the wrap up because I want to share more with you about this and some ways to explore this practice for yourself. And so how you show up today in a COO role in an agency. So you spent time doing the work with clients and now you're kind of leading the work in a way and leading the organization in a different type of way. What do you love about this COO work?
Again, I love a meaty challenge. I don't want to say problem to solve because that would imply that something's wrong. And I love the process. And I think that's also when I was talking about writing, it's not, I want to write a book and done. It's I'm writing a little bit here and then a little bit there and it builds. And I mean, Zapwater, we're approaching our 20th anniversary as an agency next year. And it started with just my boss and has grown to, 40 people, 3 offices. And it's really an incredible time. And I came on to, kind of improve upon processes that were in place, recognize, looking at our roles and do they still make sense at 40 as it did at 20 people? And, that kind of work, it's like you're working in collaboration with people across the agency. It's getting feedback from every level, recognizing what are those suggestions that rise to the top, and then, how do we put this into place? And it's not all me either. So, we've launched various committees, and it's been really exciting to see employees lean in and, take the charge on some of these things. So as much as I am a builder, and I think, that was definitely my role for the first year and a half, I've also been focusing on helping others lead the way. And, what can I teach them? What can I bring them into after seeing how it's done, how they can do that themselves?
Yeah, I love that. I know you're familiar with Creative Mornings, but I've been on the leadership team for our Chicago chapter for a little while, and just this past year kind of moved into an operations lead role. And I was joking with our host who I was talking to about how I'm helping, contributing, adding value. And I was like, so my job is to be professionally nosy and get into everybody's business and just fix things and find out what needs to be fixed. And I was like, this sounds perfect. I just get to have an opinion on everything. And so I'm curious how you feel about operations in that sense.
I have made the same joke, and I don't know, there may be some colleagues who won't appreciate the joke, but I say that I have my mother's dream job and that I get to tell people what to do and how to spend their money.
Yeah.
And that's not 100% true in the day-to-day, but, again, to what are the best practices of how we work? And again, it doesn't all come from my head. I would say 80% of it doesn't come from my head, but it's collecting of how has it worked before? What do you think we need to do? Because I'm also not in the day-to-day that other people are. And I also think operations, yes, I grew up in my career and obviously my other interests as a words person. And again, if you remember, my father wanted me to be a lawyer. I was very, very close to that. Also having that numbers brain and playing in Excel and making my little charts. I always joke about I've got a chart for that. And I'm sure I bother my colleagues with that as well. But it's a way for me to visualize systems or to show, okay, it's not just verbiage of, here's how we're going to keep a close eye on accounts and make sure that we're servicing to budget or anything like that. But we're actually showing monthly, quarterly, like these are working. So it's also identifying what are those metrics and what are the goals. And when you can set those goals, you'd be so surprised. What seems impossible then becomes so much easier to accomplish. And again, where we were last year and where we are now, it's incredible. And I think there's even some people here who are surprised by some of the progress that we've made.
It's making me think of like, so when I was in the corporate world, it was very clear what my action plan was and what my quarterly goals were and all the metrics to hit and all of that stuff, right? So it's like very structured and not static. It can obviously like get altered throughout the year, but for the most part, like your goals were your goals for the year. And now in an independent business, there's so much less control, but there's so much more opportunity so that I really don't have quarterly goals anymore. And I'm getting to the point where now I'm going to start having that stuff. But in those first few years, it was like I would set quarterly goals and then I would laugh at myself later because I'd either like not even come close to hitting them or like way blow them out of the water. And so it's just funny because I feel like in a high growth agency world that you're in right now, you're kind of in the middle where you have to set goals, but you have to leave room for these big changes that are coming across. And like, how do you do both?
Yeah, we have to be nimble. That's the number one role of an agency. Things are always changing. And I know you spoke to our agency just about change because change is constant. It's the only thing we can rely on in the agency world. And I think it comes back to what I talked about at the beginning of our conversation. It's only set the goals that make sense for you and as often as it makes sense for you as an individual, as a company, and giving yourself grace. So it's knowing when to push yourself, knowing when to let yourself rest, what is realistic given everything else going on in your life, including, staying healthy, seeing friends. And, we have been talking a lot about obviously work and things that are external, like publishing, writing, or, putting on a show, but it's a lot of inner work too. And again, I used to be very hard on myself and, always felt I wasn't doing enough. And I would spend time and energy on not all of the right things that just left me exhausted. So it's also really being quiet and paying attention to myself to know what is adding to my life. And of course, there's always going to be some things, especially in our work lives that, we're just going to have to do that we don't like 100% love. But it's also recognizing the gratitude in that. I think we appreciate our jobs even when those hard moments become okay. Where it's like, yeah, like that was a really tough conversation, but look at even how that has improved. That we can be vulnerable with each other and we can move things forward. Because change doesn't happen overnight. Change happens in conversations.
It's funny. I was like, I feel like you're just someone who like never lets yourself get bored. And so
oh my gosh,
you're probably very comfortable in the chaos. Well, you've already mentioned that you are, you enjoy kind of making sense and of making order out of chaos.
Yes. And that's a question I asked my therapist. I'm like, is this a problem that I always need a problem? But, and I know you've talked about this too in the past of just letting yourself be bored, letting yourself see what comes up. I do a lot of yoga. And yes, it's for exercise, but it's just as much for having an hour where my mind is quiet, where I'm not scrolling a screen. And, even through the pandemic when, everyone was doing their exercise at home, it's like, oh, I need a teacher. I need a physical space to go where, people turn on the lights, they put on calm music, and like they tell me to stay and breathe in the same position for like 2 minutes. I'm not going to do that for myself. I'm going to breeze through what's comfortable and, never challenge myself. So it's also don't get into that rut of ease. Be easy on yourself, but keep growing, keep flexing different muscles that you don't always use.
Yeah. I think about, like you mentioned yoga. I picked up reformer Pilates after I kind of injured myself a couple of years ago. And it is one of those moments where like I have to focus on my breath and movement so much that I can't think about other stuff. And it is like it does so much for me in that sense, like not just physically, but mentally, right? To make myself shut off the thoughts.
Yeah.
So
I even
I love
find
that practice for you.
if there's, an email or a conversation that I just don't want to deal with, or I don't know how I'm going to respond, if I go to class, I will often come out with a solution. So it's not always pushing to do something, but it's just like letting it be and getting into a calm space, never reacting from the moment. I think you and I both know that is sound advice, but to respond, with something that is thoughtful and meaningful and considerate and, still strategic and still moving things forward.
Yeah, it's great. It's like you're just putting that thing on the back burner for a while and like it figures itself out, right? Your brain is probably in the background somewhere doing something and or values that rest. So, yeah.
Yeah.
So we hear a lot about the value of rest, and often it's physical rest that's being referred to when we talk about rest, but we need to be thinking about mental rest also. Giving your brain a moment to process everything that's already in there versus filling it with more stuff. Now, this feels like a particularly important topic for me right now in my life as I'm focusing on making more space in my mind. And what I mean by this is to kind of clear out some room to not consume as much information, to give my brain more idle time. And it's probably not a coincidence that we just talked about how many of us might stay busy as a coping mechanism to avoid dealing with difficult emotions. Part of the problem is, I think this is in the media a lot, we feel like we need to optimize every moment of our day, which I believe is a function of capitalism and the type of society that we exist in where more is always better. And that's just not the truth. We don't leave ourselves room for ideas to gel or thoughts to connect when we're optimizing the efficiency of every single minute of every single day. Now, for me, even entertainment can play a role in this. I'll tell myself I'm doing something restful because I'm binging Netflix or scrolling TikTok, but it's really not giving my brain a break. Even though I'm not consuming information per se, I'm being entertained actually, but it still has the same effect. And I will add that this is something that I've noticed for myself. There may be lots of people who might benefit from that entertaining, zone out type of mental rest. And probably for all of us, it has the potential to go from a good zoning out to some type of avoidance. So it's just something to watch out for. Now, Amanda mentioned a previous episode of the podcast where we talk about the value of boredom. And this was in episode 47, which was a 2-part series all about the benefits of taking a career break and how to make one happen. And that's certainly one way to find that mental space by taking a break from your career, but it's not practical for everybody. We can make more space in smaller, more practical ways, like Amanda mentioned, getting up and moving or working out when you feel stuck or like a solution to a problem is just getting away from you. Some other small ways to do this could look like waiting in line at the grocery store without replying to texts or making phone calls or scrolling through social media, and just being in the line and letting your brain just be or go wherever it wants to go. You could also go for a walk without music or podcasts or audiobooks playing in your ears. It's really just about having the absence of some outside stimulus and just letting your brain go wherever it wanders. Okay, let's get back to the conversation where we wrap up by talking about how Amanda leverages her passions to drive change and the tools that have been most helpful for her in her journey. So you have this full-time job. You also do a lot of other things outside of your quote unquote day job. And one of those things is being super involved in your community library system. And I'm curious, how did you come about that? Obviously you love words and writing and all the things. It seems like a natural fit, but where did that start?
Yes. And if you can believe, there's still more things that I'm doing that we haven't talked about yet. And you're right. It's same with writing. I grew up going to the library, and my mother, it was almost part of our daily routine, and reading was a big stressor in our house. And where I got involved recently is there was a challenge with my local library And I got very defensive. I was like, not on my watch. What do I need to do? I'm a person, I think I've always considered myself an activist, even if my ability to be activist, has waxed and waned throughout the years. And, I found out that my local library has a foundation, and, I reached out to those folks and I was like, how can I help? Because I want to help. And because my role in my day job has become more operationally focused, I almost view my volunteering as my client work. The foundation is a 501c3, so it is a nonprofit. I'm also learning a lot because the library system itself is government, so there's a little bit of politics involved. Even in the last 2 years, I've gotten to know my village council people and other great activist groups. And so it's also nice to see this isn't like a one-woman crusade. There's plenty of people who have existed in the space for a long time doing great work. So it's how can I be a part of that and learn from them and what they know, but also see where I can provide my unique skills. So that's where operations and communications has, played a part, because the foundation, we launched social media channels in the past year. We revived our email newsletter. I have limited, fundraising and event planning experience. That's where some of that producer mindset came in. And we hosted a fundraiser and it did really well. And we were able to message, why libraries are so important and vital and, fundamental to democracy. And here's what's at stake, not just in our community, but around the country. And now still we're still in a vital moment for libraries. And I know that I will be doing a lot of work in the next year and more. But we also, again, have that foundation in place so that we're able to build upon some of those basics, like figuring out our fundraising mechanisms, our website, all of that.
So what have been some of the tools as you think about your evolution in your career? What have been some of the tools or even exercises or coaching or all those things that have really helped you come to this place right now?
I would say, therapy has been a huge tool. I'll say that.
Yes.
And just understanding myself and recognizing when I'm out of balance, and with that physical balance and otherwise, I would say yoga is a big part of my maintenance. I'm a big vision boarder. I used to do it at least once a year, and now I'm even starting to do it midway through the year because our goals, again, shift, and they don't have to happen on the January 1st timeline. I also joke as an Aries that, the astrological new year doesn't start until Aries season. So Q1 is often planning mode for me, although, of course, I'm still just today was tinkering with some New Year's resolutions. So I think I'm always setting and evaluating goals. I used to be a better journaler. I should get back into journaling. But I think, again, any exercise, I know some people who are into crafts. I'm horrible at crafts. I'm also not good at Pilates. Any exercise where you get to know yourself, and not everything has to be quote unquote work related. I think it's even better to have interest and pursue those interests outside of work to better inform and make you a well-rounded person at work. And again, it's yes, there are things, if you directly want to pursue things, but it's almost that indirect way of, if you're living your authentic life, the solution will naturally appear, or the right opportunity will naturally appear, or you'll create that new opportunity for yourself.
Yeah.
So I'm a big believer in just trusting your intuition, listening to your intuition, especially for women. We know ourselves more than the world would let us think. So following your voice and let your voice be heard.
Okay, I have 2 questions for you. Why are you bad at crafts? What is it?
I'm too impatient.
Okay. Yes.
I'm just
the methodical nature. Great. Okay. And what is your vision boarding process? What do you do?
Yeah. So, and the reason I started doing it mid-year is because my library does a magazine giveaway when they're just getting rid of all the old magazines just to make space. So then I come away with a boatload of magazines. So it's usually a multi-step process of, going through and just ripping things up without really anything in mind. Then starting to lay out, starting to put things in different groups, I'd say. And I think in the past couple of years, it's been, a work, a writing, and now, a library, activism circle. And usually in the middle, there's some words that fit into all things. I'm not at home. I don't have mine in front of me. If there's like show notes, like I'm happy to send you a photo. And even because I keep all my old ones like in a closet, and I was in there for some reason, I was looking at them and I could even see the evolution of the vision boards. And for myself, I have like a writing project tracker. And I've been doing that since like 2016. And to see on each tab the evolution of like what I was putting my focus on, and then sometimes the list got bigger and sometimes it got smaller as I was focusing solely on fewer projects. So again, like letting your past accomplishments inspire you of like, I don't know how, but somehow I got to the right path, but it was also here all along. And that's where journaling, when I do it, is important because our subconscious, our brain, is often smarter than we know. And sometimes the answer is there in your own handwriting from months ago that you just forgot because, we were going about our days.
That's so interesting. I've generally, this is funny because I said I hated cover letters and you're great at writing them. I also hate journaling, but morning pages for me has been different because it's like, oh, I'm going to throw these away afterwards or whatever. It's just like brain dump, right? But that is so interesting that like if you're going to go back through your journal and figuring out that maybe you had the answers to certain things or you knew certain things like a long time ago, I think that's really cool.
And I'd say morning pages and journaling are pretty much the same thing. And I try to write just like a page unless I'm really going. And it's usually, sometimes it takes into the last sentence to have an insight because I'm like, here's what I'm doing, or here's what I did yesterday, and here's what I'm about to do for the rest of my day. And then all of a sudden it's like, oh my gosh, and then this, thing about my childhood. So it is, getting the cobwebs out to let the insights through.
I love that your process for vision boarding is actually like kind of intuition driven too, based on what I'm hearing, right? It's just like flipping through things and like pulling out what speaks to you, which I think in a way like that is the purpose of morning pages, is like to just turn inward, right? And tune in to like what's actually already going on in your mind or in your heart, and kind of going from your gut instincts around like what you see is a cool way to start the process.
Yes, very, very witchy vibes.
Yeah. So what is next for you in your career evolution as we wrap up here? Or in your growth as a human,
Yes.
Growth as a human, career growth?
I think in an operational role like I'm in, and again, and agency life too, there's always change and there's always growth and there's always new things to conquer. And, I won't speak out of turn with some things that are coming ahead for Zapwater, but, next year is poised to be like our biggest year. And there's some very exciting things happening where I can see my role evolving. And that being said, I'm still very much leaning into my volunteer work and wanting to reinvigorate my writing. I don't know if I mentioned to you, but I did spend, for the first time, highly recommend it, especially to women. I took a week-long solo trip precisely because I hadn't had time much this year to write, to just focus on my writing. And while I haven't gotten quite back into the same swing of things since then, that was in September, a few months ago, it again reminded me of, look at what happens when I put energy towards myself and my own projects versus putting my energy outwards. So if anything, it was a reminder that it's possible and that I can do it again. And some years are just going to be off years. That's going to happen. And there were, other things going on in my life that needed my attention, and that's okay. But I'm ready to get back to the page, when the energy is there and the time is right.
What do you think that process or the practice will look like for you, given everything you have going on in your life? Is it a small, maybe semi-daily thing, or kind of sectioning it out, right? Compartmentalizing it in like a weekend away or a week away like you just did? I'm wondering if you are leaning into like a certain way that feels right for you right now.
Yeah, and I used to be very disciplined about writing after work and on weekends. And when I did take a little break in between agencies, I was writing every day because that's what I set out to do. For the first time, because I did do that week away trip, I've never applied for residency. So a writing residency is exactly what it sounds like. You go somewhere to write. And I'm like, well, I could do that at home. Why would I go elsewhere? But I see the value in that now, because even though I do not have children at home, there are still other distractions at home. And in this week away, like, I didn't turn on the TV. I surrounded myself with literary activities, so it was very much an art-focused week. And with some of these residencies too, it's not only yourself, there's other writers there. So you're in that type of space and inspiring each other, and even like reading your work at night. And I never went to grad school to get like my MFA or MBA or anything like that. So what I hear from people who have gone to both of those things is that it's really all about the networking and the connections. And that's just a nice way to do that. And also, for anyone, whether it's writing or anything else, I will say, and my husband reminded me, it's like people do spend money on their hobbies. So, and I think for women too, where it's like, oh, the time or the expense or like whatever it is, that's okay. Men will go, they'll do their sports weekend in Vegas, they'll spend money on like craft beer and like woodworking tools or whatever else. And like, we get to have our things too.
Like, it is an investment in yourself. And I think when you're around other people, I think there's something to be said for getting into that creative space by yourself, but then being in community with others with a shared goal. Like, some amazing things could come out of that. So I love that for you. Great. Well, I'm going to wrap us up here, but I so appreciate you being on and sharing about all the different parts of your career. I think it's inspiring how much you do and how you're really leading yourself from like this place of what you really care about and what feels important to you in the moment. And so I appreciate that.
Thank you. Yeah. And that comes back to those words I identified. It's impact, integrity, and throughout it all, you got to have some joy.
Yeah, that's going to be a focus for me this year. I need more of that. So I'll be texting you for a coffee later, and you
more
can help
joy
me
in 2025.
Exactly. 100%. All right. Thank you, Amanda.
Thank you.
Okay. That conversation sparked a lot of insight and inspiration for me. There are a ton of things that I'm personally working on that we touched on in the conversation, and I really love when that happens. I hope that you're walking away seeing how much possibility that we can have in our careers when we're really intentional about pursuing our passions and our interests, and we're open to change and some level of uncertainty. Amanda does so much, and she gets a lot of both personal and professional fulfillment out of her day job as the COO of an agency and in her other roles within her community and her creative pursuits and the art that she produces. Now, I mentioned I'd go back to this topic of core values versus leadership principles, and it's a really timely one because I'm working on these now with a coaching client, and it's bringing her a ton of clarity and discovering and defining the words that capture who she is and how she shows up. Now, I'm kind of a stickler about language, and I really push all of my clients to be super intentional and very specific when they're doing this work. And you already heard my soapbox about how convoluted the word values can sometimes get. Now, if you want to define your core values and your leadership principles for yourself, I would recommend any leader in any organization do this, by the way. I'd recommend that you have both clearly articulated because it benefits you in understanding yourself in a different way, but also really benefits your people so they can understand you better. And you can kind of start here. So for values, it's really about who you are. And for leadership principles, it's really about how you lead. You should see certainly that your values are often reflected in your leadership principles. So as an example, if my client chooses empathy as a core value, and of course, I would urge her to define that really clearly. What does that mean for her? Empathy is really just part of who she is every day, and she can't turn it off. It's a core value. Now, the leadership principle that could be something that aligns with that is people over profits or people first. So in this example, she would use her core value of empathy, this thing that's just part of who she is, to lead in a way that prioritizes the humans that work in her organization. So think about values this way. Who are you when you're not trying? What explains why you are the way you are? What filters do you use when you're making tough decisions in life? And I believe that if it's something you have to make an effort or really stretch to be, it shouldn't be on your list of core values. Now, this doesn't mean it's not important to you or something that you're trying to do, but I personally don't think it's defined as a core value. For leadership principles, I would think about them more this way. It's how you approach things. It's more action-oriented than values. Values are really about being, and leadership principles are really about doing. This looks like your most authentic way of solving problems, or where your focus lies, or what's important to you in relationship to others or relationship to your work. And as I mentioned before, I think there's some room for how you aspire to show up consistently. Maybe you're leading this way, but you have off days sometimes, and frankly, we all do. So a couple of tools that I would recommend for exploring these. First is going to be the Enneagram, which is always my go-to tool for me for anything self-exploration. And in episodes 20 and 21, I deep dive into the types and everything that you know to get started. Now, the Enneagram is rooted in 9 main sets of motivations that drive our behavior. It really helps us understand the why behind what we do, and it helps us see the values that may already really be at play in our lives. We just maybe haven't named them yet. The second one is what's called the RBSE, the Reflected Best Self exercise. And I've talked about this exercise before a lot on this podcast, and this is another great tool to use here. The RBSE is an exercise where people who know you best send in stories about you, and you can distill them down into themes, find the things that come up really often or that are commonalities between these different examples that people share. And it really helps you see what you're known for, or it helps you answer the question, what do others see in you that you barely even notice because it comes so naturally? Now, the third one is checking out episode 7. So I discussed values in this episode with my guest, Antonio Garcia, and I shared some really great resources for doing kind of a more basic values exercise where you're finding what are your words and defining them. And I went into some examples from my own life in the wrap up. So you could check out episode 7 if you want to come up with your core values. Now, the last thing that I'm going to share is that while these are really incredible exercises to do solo, they're also really good team exercises. They're things you can do together to help your team bond, build trust, and truly know each other so that you can operate more effectively as a cohesive team. And this is actually the majority of what I do in my business. And I'd love to have a conversation with you if you think that your team can benefit from exploring any of these areas. You can always reach out to me via email at hello@selfatwork.com, or find me on LinkedIn or Instagram, or just come to my website and set up a call.